Well, here's another video, the most exciting one, composition in photography. This is just going to be an overview of different composition strategies. The key thing I want you to know for this is simply the terminology so that when we talk about it, you are clear on what we're talking about. Now, of course, like any of these, don't forget that any composition is not absolute in and of itself. Multiple compositions can be present in any one photo, but the examples I'm going to give you will attempt to be primarily for that composition strategy. Let's move forward. Rule of thirds is pretty much the basic go-to strategy. Pretty obviously, there are kind of multiple cuts here, creating three different levels. So when you talk about the rule of thirds, the idea is you never want a picture right in the center, dead center. You often want a picture just off to the left, or just off to the right, or just at the bottom, just at the top. Most people will talk about how you want the subject kind of on one of these corners in rule of thirds. This one, therefore, does a great job because it has it on this rightmost kind of thirds here, and it's doing a good job balancing that. If that were in the middle, right here, we would consider that a poor composition and not adhering to the rule of thirds. Balancing elements essentially takes the rule of thirds concept and talks about how it balances within that rule of thirds. So if you imagine again that you have that rule of thirds right here, whatever, that's pretty good. Then you notice that this is over on the right area, the rightmost area, and this is over on the leftmost area. Now in this case, you get kind of a nice balance at a diagonal pattern, but anything as far as elements that would exist that maybe would be here and here, or here and here, or here and here, would do a nice job of balancing based upon that rule of thirds. Of course, you can also have multiple elements, let's say all four corners, that could work as well. But the idea is that it needs to balance. It needs to be equal on both portions. Here's a nice example from Fitsum, who was a student 2 years ago. He took this nice picture of cross-country runners, which illustrates nicely a balancing element. Now, in this case, you might say, well, isn't it bad because she's right in the middle on that rule of thirds? But that's not exactly true because, in this case, also, the composition looks sharp and as we can tell, you have a nice balance between all three people here. So they're all in their own plane. It also does kind of a nice job of angling down, and she is running in front of everybody, but because of the aperture, she's somewhat blurred out. The best composition would be if she were blurred out as well, but in this case, it does a nice job of highlighting melange in the middle here. For some reason, leading lines seem to be what students struggle with most. I'll show you a few examples of leading lines that work pretty well. But the basic concept of leading lines, as illustrated in this picture, is that you enter into a picture, typically at the bottom corner, it can be kind of anywhere, and then you enter into that picture in this case, and it goes to a background. Typically, it's an unfulfilled line that ends up terminating somewhere in the background. A lot of kind of typical ones that you might see might exist kind of like this. So if this is our frame, you might have like a road that goes out there, and then it terminates in the back here, meaning it goes into like a mountain or something, that kind of setting. And you don't see it, but what it does is it leads the viewer's eyes into that picture by entering at the foreground and ending within the picture, if that makes sense. Students, again, for some reason kind of struggle with that concept. I'm not sure why, but that notion of leading lines functions pretty well when you think about having to enter in, typically at the bottom, and go into the picture. Symmetry and patterns are similar to balancing elements, the difference being it should be perfectly symmetrical to make it symmetry and patterns. And this one, of course, you can see if you cut it right down the middle like I just did, on both sides you're essentially getting the same elements. unlike, of course, you can ignore this guy right here. Those minor differences, or the fact that these two planters are a little bit different, those minor differences are not a huge deal. The key thing is that you're aware of the symmetry between the two halves. You can do this, of course, with faces. That's what oftentimes people are attracted to. You can do it with classrooms. Anytime you're in a situation, consider what might make it symmetrical, and that can often appeal to the viewer in kind of a cool picture. Viewpoint is kind of one of those that you could write on any picture, but the idea is that you're actually choosing a unique vantage point. Too often, we take a picture and it ends up being from us standing in something directly in front of us. In this case, of course, you would have a photographer maybe up on a hill here, and if they're taking the picture, they're taking it down at the beach here, versus if they're actually down on the beach and they take a picture, obviously of that kind of head level area. By doing this, you get a cool vantage point where they did a nice job giving the person in this picture so that it offers a scale to the size of what we're seeing here. You also get the tire tracks that offer somewhat a size awareness here. But by doing so, you make it more unique, you make it something interesting to look at versus a typical shot of an ocean that might come across as cliche. Background in this situation is talking about what's back here, not anything else. And really what that's talking about is, especially when you take a picture of someone doing something, oftentimes you can get a color in the background or some kind of faded image. And by doing so, it helps to really accent what's going on in the foreground. Now, this one probably has a pretty wide open aperture, so something like a 1.4 or 2.8, something like that. And by doing so, it creates a darkness behind the violinist, which ends up making a pretty appealing picture here. When we're talking about depth, we're really talking about how many layers there are, if you want to think of it that way. So, if we break this apart, we have one layer up here. This is kind of our foreground. Then we have another one here, then we have another one here, another one here, and then really these are all kind of together back here, but you could even split it up a little bit. By doing so, you end up, if we kind of color these in, you end up getting a really cool difference in depth here that offers the viewer something further to see. I encourage you as you work through the year to work with depth and think about how kind of layers help accentuate oftentimes what's in the foreground, okay, so what's all up here. It makes it more dynamic, it makes it more engaging for the viewer. You can often do this with crowds at sports games, oftentimes in games, if you get different depth of players, things like that. Framing can really make or break a picture. Oftentimes people use others' heads, they'll use something physical in the area, so if you're at a sports game, it could be the goalposts, it could be a couple coaches and then a player in between. In this case, you have kind of a cliche lake scene here, but it is framed nicely by using the mountains here to create a nice frame of this inside. So you're looking primarily here when your when your eyes, enter the picture. Cropping's really good if you want to isolate something. In this picture, for instance, you might have had a whole array of different little hugging salt and pepper shakers here. And by cropping it in and really focusing on just these two and offsetting it in a rules of thirds kind of way, you get a nice image here in which you have some salt and pepper shakers that look, kind of appealing as they might be like people or something like that. So by cropping it, you're able to isolate really what you want in the picture. We'll be doing this a lot with sports pictures and limiting the distractions in the pictures. Also, you might notice they do get some kind of symmetry in here if you think about how these are all moving in a line here, which is nice. So here's an example in which they did some cropping. I'll show you this picture, and then the next picture will be from a student who graduated who cropped it out, and they chose to eliminate this player and this referee here. So you see, by cropping those, it's not that it necessarily makes it a much more dynamic picture, but what it does is it limits what the viewer can see so that you're establishing a really nice illustration of what the player is doing and where you are assuming the action's going. So in any picture, you want action to really enter the picture. And here, we've done a nice job, the photographer's done a nice job cropping it to make a rule of thirds, so we have action over here and action over here. What they've also done nicely is the action in a sports picture, it's going to go this way. And by doing so, you get some movement in the picture. There's some tension there in which the viewer is excited about hearing what happens to this ball and if it's going to be scored. This is a great picture for a newspaper, for some kind of magazine that wants to illustrate that kind of moment before a goal was scored. Here's another instance in which it's a good picture, nothing really wrong with it. It's a little bit off in the sense that you're wasting a lot of space over here. So they chose to crop it to get rid of the space. Also, this dude isn't doing much here. He's just kind of running away, looking like he forgot what's going on. So by cropping this, you end up cutting out a lot of this wasted space. Now you still have this guy, and maybe that works. Maybe they chose to do that because it does kind of offer a layering. If he's in the foreground, he's kind of middle ground, and he's background. That kind of works, maybe as an excuse, but you could really crop this and almost just bring it into that frame and get rid of all this distraction out here because we're really focused on the guy's reaction, the ball, and then maybe the other player. Because it's in daylight, you should have had a low ISO, and therefore you can crop it because you should have a really good quality of a picture there. The last one's kind of a generic category, and I don't want to see this on your roll sheets because it tends to be a cop-out, but it's just the notion of experimentation. But with experimentation, I do want you to always consider the different principles of composition that we've just now looked through. However, you can break those rules at any time, right? You don't have to follow those rules of composition. In this case, you get a nice illustration of somewhat balance between the sky here and the wheat field there. You also get a cool illustration of that one tree. It's a little bit cliche, but that one tree certainly draws the viewer's eyes. Similarly, you almost get a sense of leading lines here because these kind of rows of wheat here lead the viewer into that tree based on the way they're shaped. So it's kind of a cool illustration of experimentation of trying to combine multiple elements to get the best picture. Remember that all composition is thought through. It should be thorough and thought out beforehand. And there should always be a reason for it. What are you trying to accentuate? What are you trying to do to get the picture to say the story that you're wanting to tell? That's all. See you tomorrow.